Hello and welcome to Markets Today with me, Lukman Haris. Today, the ringgit closed at 4.18 to the US dollar, but the FBMK LCI ended 10.62 points lower at 1722.99 points. Alright, we start off today's episode with the business brief. AirAsia Group expects its ASEAN holding company to be set up within 5 or 6 months. Its group CEO Tan Sri Tony Fernandes says they are now sorting the legal aspects of creating a single ASEAN airline. Fernandes says that the goal is to have a single ASEAN holding company which owns its subsidiary airlines 100%. Currently, the AirAsia Group owns a 49% stake in AirAsia Indonesia, AirAsia Philippines and AirAsia Thailand, respectively. Malaysia's Retirement Fund, or QAP, wants to increase its investments abroad from 12% to 15% as domestic returns slow. According to a calculation by Reuters, this increase amounts to around 3.7 billion ringgit shifting into foreign investments. In 2013, QAP received board approval to invest up to 19% of its assets abroad. But a dive in the ringgit 2 years later saw the government urge funds to repatriate capital and limit foreign exposure. QAP has invested $30 million into Uber last year. Oil prices slid today after the International Energy Agency presented a rather bleak outlook for 2018. The IEA cut its oil demand growth forecast by 100,000 barrels per day for this year and next. Crude prices are now down by about 5% since hitting 2015 highs last week, ending a 40% rally which started in June. The IEA says supply is expected to exceed demand by 600,000 barrels per day in the first quarter of 2018 and 200,000 barrels per day in the second quarter. And more experts are raising concerns on the state of the country's property market. Recently, real estate veteran Ernest Cheong has been quoted by local online portal FMT as saying that the sector is in for a rough ride next year. He quoted Deputy Finance Minister Lee Chi Leong, who revealed that unsold completed residential units rose by 40% in the first half of 2017 compared to the same period last year. Ernest says property developers also risk losing their bridging finance from banks if they fail to sell at least 40% of their total units, risking a market crash within 24 to 30 months. And joining me on the line to discuss that last piece of news just now is Shan Said. He's the Chief Economist of IQI Global Property Consultancy Company. Shan, thanks for joining us on the show. First of all, the concern about the property market, in your opinion, is the fear justified or is it overblown?
I think the property market is going through structural changes whereby some areas the prices are going up and there are some areas the prices are going down. Property market moves with GDP growth, which is very solid and is on the upsurge. So the concerns are not in line with market forces. I'm quite buoyant on the economy and the real estate market. To tell you, at IQI, the transaction amount has gone up by 100% as of last year. So I still feel that customers are buying because the income levels are rising. So I think these concerns are unfounded.
But nevertheless, since last year, we've been seeing the number of unsold units increasing. So what do you make of this?
I think market forces determine the price of every asset, and every asset has a threshold in pricing and valuation structure. Yes, there are some units that are unsold in the real estate market. There are many units unsold in Singapore, London, Toronto, and Sydney, but that does not make those markets bad. Investors are still buying as per the market valuations.
But do you think that property developers have been downplaying fears to sell their units?
I think the developers have become very smarter, like the developers like Exim and UOA and EcoWorld and SP Satya. They're trying to fathom the market condition and requirements of the clients, and they're aligning the strategy according to the client's requirement. So I think it should not be a concern for some developers.
But there is nevertheless undeniably a property glut. So these developers, and not just the ones that you've mentioned, but generally speaking, these developers are building more and more. So do you think it's wise for them to contribute to the property glut?
They are making smarter moves and they are going headway in the market. The market is still very much favorable for clients because the Malaysian market is still undervalued as compared to the ASEAN region. So these developers have played their cards very strategically and smartly.
There are also financing concerns, Shan, that we are making loans too easy to obtain for people who actually cannot afford them. So, do you think the financing system is actually healthy? Do we make loans easier to obtain, or should we make lending rules stricter?
I think you can't give dictation to the banks what they should do and what they should not do. Banks need to decide as per their policies and procedures. Banks are still lending money in the real estate market as per the client profile and credentials. So I think you can't give dictation to banks what they should do and what they should not do. Banks are still lending money, and they're willing to lend money in the real estate market.
Well, I think it's not telling them what to do, but in your professional opinion, do you honestly think there's a property bubble brewing in Malaysia, as some are claiming?
A bubble happens when the land prices are crashing. Not a single area, whether in KL or Penang or in Johor Bahru, where land prices are crashing. Land prices are moving upward in a very structured manner. So there is no bubble as such in Malaysia.
Right. Thanks, Shan Said, IQI Global Chief Economist, discussing with us on the state of the property market and whether we should worry about a bubble being formed within the sector in Malaysia. We'll be right back. When we return, a preview of this Friday's third quarter GDP announcement. What can we expect right after this? You're back with Markets Today with me, Luqman Haris. Bank Negara is set to announce the country's third quarter GDP and financial results this Friday. For the past 2 quarters, GDP growth has surprised most, with a 5.6% growth in the first quarter and an even more impressive 5.8% in the second. But will we be able to sustain this momentum this quarter? And more importantly, how can headline GDP numbers actually translate to the common man on the ground being better off, at least financially? And joining me on the line to discuss that further is Dr. Afzanizam Abdul Rashid. He's Bank Islam's chief economist. Doctor, thanks for joining us on the show.
Oh, you're welcome.
First of all, this announcement coming up in a couple of days' time, what should we look out for?
Well, I think the most important numbers that we should look at, obviously apart from the headlines, is actually the consumer spending. As you rightly point out, I mean, the last 2 quarters we have seen the GDP numbers actually beyond that than what the market expect. And in this time around, I think it shouldn't be. I mean, it shouldn't be any much different from that, because the way I see it, especially on the consumer spending, I think there's an element of surprise there, because with all due respect, we have seen consumer sentiment remain weak. You know, if it's based on Consumer Sentiment Index produced by MIR. It has been below 100 points for, I think, more than 2 years now. But in recent period, we have seen that this sentiment and the actual spending for some, it has dichotomized. It has gone different direction, perhaps because of the stability in the labor market conditions, and perhaps some wealth effect from the improvement in the equity markets. And that actually contributes to the sustained growth in the consumer spending. And to illustrate this, I think the survey done by the Department of Statistics with regards to domestic tourism should shed some light. If you look at domestic tourism expenditure last year, it amounts about 74.8 billion ringgit. That's actually equivalent to about 6.1% of GDP. And we understand that last year, if you look at the GDP numbers, is actually among the lowest point. You know, I mean, GDP growth was at 4.2%, but at that time, domestic tourism expenditure went up to 74.8 billion, and 1/3 of it is going to spending. So I think that the dynamics in the consumption space is actually matters now.
Well, the issue in everyone's mind, as you've hinted towards just now, since budget 2018 especially, is the status of disposable income amongst Malaysians. So all those things that you're pointing out just now, expecting positivity and the increase of domestic tourism and things like that, does that translate? Does that mean that people now have more extra money to spend?
Mm-hmm. I think you have to be clear on GDP numbers. It does not measure, say, happiness. Yes. Because GDP actually measures the output growth. So if you look at the literature on the relationship between happiness and growth is always from growth to happiness. But I think it's a kind of a research question there. Actually, I think it's also happiness also affect the level of GDP. I think that's what really matters, because your state of mind can actually have an impact. The way the productivity level, for instance, that can actually have an impact in terms of GDP growth going forward and the sustainability of it. So I think we need to be clear on the GDP numbers, what it measures actually.
Yeah, but what you're saying points to my next question, which is for the past 2 quarters, GDP numbers have been quite impressive. But some are saying that the effect is not felt by the man on the ground. So how do you think good headline GDP numbers would actually translate to the common man being better off, especially financially?
True. I think we have to acknowledge the fact that there's changes in business landscape. For instance, if you look at the smartphone penetration rates, if you look at the main telco players, the penetration rate for smartphones, in 2013 it was around 25% to 30%. But now, I mean, as of this year, some of the players have registered a penetration rate of 80%. So what does it tell you? It tells you that the people are changing in terms of the way they spend, in terms of digital space, digital economy. And if you look at the way people spend through the likes of Lazada, 11th Street, and perhaps through online TV station, the shopping online TV station has doing well. So I think we need to acknowledge the fact that there's a change in the business landscape that translates into consumer spending.
Well, Doctor, we have about 30 seconds. That's very briefly. Can we sustain the momentum in this quarter's GDP, and which sectors will drive the growth this quarter?
Well, obviously, if it's sector-wise, obviously export-oriented industries that will be the main factors, because if you look at in the past 9 months, we have seen a double-digit growth average in the past 9 months. So, yeah, I would say manufacturing-oriented, export-oriented industry would be the main factor contributing to the overall GDP growth.
Thanks so much, Dr. Afzal Nizam Abdul Rashid, Bank Islam Chief Economist. And that wraps up this episode of Markets Today. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at 50101 to drop us your feedback and what you think of the conversations we have on this show. And download our app, as you can find on Google Play and also the Apple App Store. Lukman Haris, thanks for watching. Have a nice day.